Welcome, welcome everyone to our Asian American Psychology lecture this year. Woohoo! Yeah, that's right, that's right. My name is Daniel Lee. I serve as the academic dean for Fuller's Center for Asian American Theology and Ministry. And this week we've been celebrating Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. We've had a number of just amazing events, book panels, Asian American Theology lecture, we have artists, and so all that stuff will be packaged and presented to you if you've missed any of that. This evening, we will be covering healing spiritual and emotional wounds, Asian Americans in the church. Now, as you know, the church is kind of like a family. Like we get all the love, but you know, the other stuff comes as well. There's a lot of pain, right? And as you know, like during COVID in so many different ways because of all the racial dimensions of it, whether it be in the Asian American church or in the multi-ethnic church, it's been difficult for Asian Americans. So we will cover some of those issues, but obviously, you know, in a span of, 2 hours, it will not be comprehensive. I think the idea is the fact that you will know what the categories are, and it'll continue the conversation. Super excited to have Dr. David Wang here. And we have a number of panelists, and they'll be all introduced later on. So I'm just so excited to have everybody online as well as people in person. It's kind of weird to have them. It's pretty exciting to have it in person, but it's also very strange. Before we continue on, we wanted to have spend some time to talk about this Conami Scholarship. And we have Reverend Eleanor Baylon, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist and an ordained Presbyterian minister and spiritual director. She's a proud alum of Fuller's MFT program, and she's going to talk about this Conami Scholarship.
Hi, my thanks to Fuller and the Asian American Center for allowing us to be here. The Royal and Jean Conami Scholarship is awarded annually to help the next generation of Christian therapists with a heart to serve the Asian American community and to give these therapists encouragement as they prepare for their service. For many years, the Conami Scholarship was housed with the Asian American Christian Counseling Service until August 2020 when AACCS sadly closed its doors. AACCS is also where I served right out of graduating from Fuller until it closed its doors last year. And it was founded more than 33 years ago to provide professional counseling services that were culturally sensitive, while also recognizing how psychology, race, and culture intersect with issues of faith. After the closure of AACCS, the Conami Scholarship found a new home with Fuller's MFT department. And we have here today, we're very fortunate to have Kent Conami, who, along with his siblings, helped create the scholarship in honor of his parents and who served on the board of AACCS for many years. Kent, would you come and share a few words?
Thank you for having me here tonight. Back in 2011, my parents, Rio and Jean, and my family started the Conami Scholarship to support and encourage the next generation of Christian counselors. We know the great need there is to help the hurting and the brokenhearted, and your program here is a blessing to so many. It's been our honor to award over 22 scholarships during that time. And my parents and my brother and I really have enjoyed meeting the recipients and hearing about their vision for serving the Asian American community and the community at large. I want to thank the Fuller School of Psychology and the Marriage and Family Therapy for overseeing this scholarship and want to congratulate this year's recipients and wish them God's richest blessings. I had the privilege of reading their essays they wrote. As you know, well, you may have known, they had to write an essay in order to apply. And I was really blessed to see their vision for serving the Asian American community, Christian community. So I want to thank the Conami Scholarship Committee, thank you, and all of you for supporting this award. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kent. After a few other things, then the scholarship recipients will come up to the front to take a picture too. So last year, the recipients were Joyce Law and William Peng, and Joyce will come and share her statement, and then I'll read Will's statement. So as part of their scholarship, each recipient is able to volunteer for at least 15 hours to either serve the needs or expand the knowledge of the needs of the AAPI community. So please join me in welcoming Joyce.
This stage is so bright. Okay, but hi everyone. My name is Joyce Law, and I am an MS-MFT student at Fuller in my last year of studies. So before I start, I would just like to thank the Komai family again for giving me the scholarship last year. It has given me so much support in my academic journey, as well as my career development. So in the past year, in all honesty, there were quite a few challenges and life changes that I had to navigate through. For example, getting married. That's great, but that's also a really challenging thing. And not to mention, the restrictions surrounding in-person gatherings and meetings. But I did try my best to learn through seminars about the AAPI community, through serving at my church every week with a predominantly Chinese congregation, as well as watching different documentaries and films about the community. The covered areas such as the Asian LGBTQIA+ community, navigating through adolescence as an Asian American, finding one's cultural roots, etc. And because of time, I will try to summarize what I learned about the AAPI community in the past year in just about 2 minutes. So, as we all know, the pandemic was a real challenge for us in many ways. For the AAPI community, it actually interacts with some of our core cultural values in a very interesting way. So for a lot of Asian cultures, the idea of blending in and not standing out fits well with our collectivist beliefs. And so far, it has worked pretty well at helping us adapt and assimilate into the society. However, since the pandemic started, Asian Americans have been singled out by many people in multiple contexts as the source and the cause of COVID-19. So one day, when my father was walking home from church in the neighborhood of Alhambra, he was approached by a lady who aggressively yelled at him and blamed him and his people for bringing in the coronavirus. So my father, who was the pastor of our church and basically one of the most peaceful and kind people that I know, simply said nothing and slowly walked on. And even though my father did absolutely nothing to provoke the lady to yell at him, he was singled out because of his Asian features. So for a lot of Asian Americans, we have been raised with the notion that it is a virtue to stay silent, that it will nurture a sense of patience and calmness within us, that it will teach us to be obedient. But as we're still continually being singled out and harassed, what do? And how might we feel? In the seminar, Dr. Russell Jones stated that for a lot of Asian Americans, we hesitate to speak out because of the knowledge that people of other ethnicities may be treated in ways that are even more dehumanizing and humiliating. We may think that since we're labeled the model minority, we mustn't be complaining. It's as if Asian Americans are caught right in the middle, where we're not white and we're not black. We're somewhere in between where we're not sure if we can breathe a sigh of relief or continue fighting for our rights. And I also learned that in the world of literature, even though we see an increase of Asian American representation and a rise in popularity of certain novels written by Asian American authors, yet there is still a serious lack of diversity in the representation. There is a very limited audience and very few ears that are willing to listen to our stories. And so while certain works may stand out and be known by the public, because there are so few stories that get heard, we still struggle to find narratives that we resonate with completely. So to conclude, as Asian Americans, we want to be included. We want to be relevant among other ethnicities and also within our own community. We do not want to be separated into a category where we exist by ourselves, when our history is so embedded and interconnected within the greater human history. Thank you.
Joyce, thank you so much. And now I will be sharing Will's statement about his volunteer experience. I was recently given the opportunity to help start a mental health support team at my church, which is an Asian American, primarily Korean American church. This effort represents what I would eventually want to help establish at Asian American churches. It was started to meet the needs of many different mental health related situations that have occurred at my church over the years, which the clergy have either felt unequipped to provide for or simply didn't have the capacity. The primary role of the team would be to provide consultation, training, and resources to the pastors and lay leaders of the church based on the most current science in the mental health field for topics related to relational, emotional, and psychological health. In more extreme cases of trauma or illness, the team could step in to triage the situation for a few days and then refer the member to other related professionals for continued care. One of the needs that this team has identified is for continued knowledge about the basics of mental health, so that church members have the language to even begin to discuss these issues. It is still a very new topic that has recently been ignited, partially due to the collective trauma that the world has experienced in the form of a pandemic, which has exacerbated some of the personal, family, and community issues for members in our church. Through some of the community meetings and training we have facilitated, it was revealed that even if people wanted to speak to these issues, they wouldn't even know where to begin. There were social and cultural stigmas that were brought up, theological tensions about integration that were voiced, and just a general discomfort with an unfamiliar topic, which can sometimes feel unsafe to discuss. To make the topics of our field more manageable, one of the missions of the team would be to demystify our field and make some of the larger concepts more relatable and practical. And that was Will's statement about his volunteer. And at long last, it is my great pleasure to announce this year's recipients of the Conami Scholarship. Would Andrew Wang and Michael Jacoby join me at the front, and then we will have a photo with Ken. I guess, is this good right here? Okay.
Congratulations and thank you for presenting the award. So I'm going to make some logistic announcements. So first one, the restroom is located outside against the wall across the breezeway, so with the green walls there. And there is a code, so if you want to go to restroom, make sure you look up the code, which is posted right on the door as you exit. And for those of you looking to obtain CE credits for this event, your attendance is recorded if you're on Zoom, but if you're here in person, make sure you sign in and sign out with Jim Cummings. And also, there's an email that's psychcu@fuller.edu, which will connect you with Jim Cummings, who's in charge of the CE unit. We will have time for questions at the end of the session, and you can text your questions during any portion of the program. The number to text is on the screen, 626-655-1775. And we also encourage those watching online to text your questions as well. And now I would like to introduce our guest lecturer for today, Dr. David Wang. Dr. David Wang is a licensed psychologist, pastor, and associate professor of both psychology and pastoral counseling at Biola University. Research-wise, he's extremely prolific. It's like someone in academic steroids. So he's prolific in his publications, he's part of journal editorial work, and also has many grant-funded projects. For example, he serves as the editor of the Journal of Psychology and Theology. He's also involved in multiple multi-million-dollar grant-funded projects. For example, Seminary Formation Assessment Project, Trauma Resilient Church Collective Program. Dr. Wang's research interests include traumatic stress, mindfulness, spiritual theology, various topics related to multicultural psychology and social justice. Dr. Wang not only teaches and speaks internationally, but he also maintains a small clinical practice in Fullerton, California. Moreover, he's a pastor of spiritual formation at One Life City Church. He also consults with Global Aftercare Program of the International Justice Mission. So he does a lot, multiple roles. Dave, I don't know how you're able to do so much, achieve so much, and also hold on to so many different important roles. But I think more importantly, I've been impressed with you as a person, your presence and your humility above and beyond all your achievements. And you're the perfect person to present on our topic, healing spiritual and emotional wounds today. And we're very honored to have this esteemed guest speaker with us. But I'm more excited to let you know that he'll be part of us at Fuller starting this summer. So let's welcome Dr. Wang.
Thank you, Dr. Wang, and really excited to be here with you, and really excited to join into the Fuller family later this fall, where I will not be the only Dr. Wang even in the School of Psychology. So we're going to have to figure out a way to identify ourselves. Really excited about that. I'm grateful to be here with you this evening to talk about this topic that is really near and dear to my heart of healing spiritual and emotional wounds from those of us who have experienced them within church contexts or ministry contexts. We're going to go into this topic in general as it applies to all Christians, and then hopefully in our panel time we'll get to contextualize this conversation more specifically into the experiences of Asian Americans. And this topic is really dear to my heart because I'm a pastor as well as a psychologist, and I think it's fair to say that I'm a psychologist today based on what I observed and bore witness and experienced as a pastor in my early 20s. When I was a college pastor at a predominantly immigrant church, I unfortunately had experienced or became one of the first individuals to find out about a case of clergy sexual misconduct. And the process of seeing this situation through was actually one of the most painful, emotionally painful experiences that I've ever experienced. And it led me into a crisis of my personal faith, as well as a crisis of my vocation. I began to ask questions such as, should I even go into ministry if this is how ministry really is? I started asking questions like, can I even trust my own Christian formation and Christian upbringing when many of its leaders are capable of doing these kinds of things behind closed doors and still operate ministry contexts like that? And these were the questions that were very dear and very much at the forefront of my mind when I went to seminary. So much so that when I finished up seminary at Regent College up in Vancouver, British Columbia, I wrote my seminary thesis on the dark night of the soul, and that was very much kind of me doing me search rather than research, because that was the state of my soul at that time as I was wondering what the heck I was going to do in my future, And through those years, the Lord has led me into the field of psychology, where I started to do research and also clinical practice in trauma and PTSD and trauma psychology. And just naturally, as I've been working with different clients and doing research in the area of trauma, I started to see some natural connections between how trauma survivors might heal from their difficult experiences and what I've also observed among many pastors and Christian leaders as they have been hurt in ministry contexts and subsequently also have engaged in their healing journey as well. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the research literature on emotional wounds in a ministry context. Then I'd like to relate it and build a bridge between that literature base and the literature base on trauma and social support, and then bring it together to potentially give us some insights on how we can support, and also for those of us who can relate to this personally, how we can continue our journey of healing and recovery from these kinds of things. And at the very end, if we have time, I'd love to share a few thoughts on the implications of this whole conversation on our journey of spiritual formation, of God shaping us and molding us more and more into his likeness. I love incorporating small group discussion. We won't do too much of that. And a lot of times when I preach at church, people complain that it's sometimes like a lecture, sometimes like a group therapy. I'm going to try my best not to recreate that here. And yet, I'd love to start at this time. And don't feel compelled to engage in this conversation, only if you feel comfortable and safe doing so. With maybe a person next to you, I'd love for you to just discuss briefly the following question. What kinds of emotional wounds have you experienced? Or perhaps a safer question is, what kind of emotional wounds have you observed in others over the course of your work and participation and service in churches and other ministry contexts? So let me give you guys a few moments to just discuss, if you're comfortable, and then we'll come and continue this conversation. Love to hear from you over the course of our evening together. Go ahead. Okay, let's come back together, everyone. And thank you for engaging this conversation. I wish I could listen in on what you guys are talking about, but from the best of my ability, and psychologists can do this, we can kind of read lips, and maybe in a lesser to extent, we can read minds. But my strong impression is, at least those of us in this room, we actually have a lot to talk about with regards to this topic. It's not something unfamiliar for us. So I hope that, so I'm really looking forward to continuing this conversation together. So when I look at the research literature, the first place to start is the vast research literature, especially as it relates to Christian leaders and clergy members, on the topic of burnout. And with some studies, especially some earlier studies, pointing out that burnout can cause up to a third of Christian leaders to consider implications of leaving what they thought would be their life work. Some more recent research, especially during the season of COVID, suggests that these figures actually might be a lot higher. In fact, some suggestions from the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton College suggest that there's actually quite a few Christian leaders out there that have already internally decided to leave. They're just waiting for the pandemic to finish so they can hand off the ministry to somebody else. So if it hasn't happened already, expect an even furthering kind of pattern of people potentially stepping down from different positions of Christian leadership. But when we're thinking of burnout among leaders, especially Christian leaders, we're thinking of, and I like this term that was coined by a couple researchers, of Christian leaders wasting out, of leaving the ministry utterly demoralized, depressed, and disillusioned with God. And one study from Hunt and colleagues identified 5 areas of emotional hazard that almost all Christian leaders must uniquely face in their ministry. And these include difficulties in personal relationships, difficult struggles related to sadness and depression, stress and burnout, struggles related to sexuality, and also struggles related to assertiveness. And as we will explore in more detail, we're going to look into many of these different areas in more detail shortly. But let me start off with the topic of sexuality. Unfortunately, there is a growing literature on the problem of clergy sexual abuse and clergy sexual misconduct. It's not just a Roman Catholic thing. It's just as common among evangelical circles, and research suggests it actually is just as common among different denominations of Christian religion, as well as potentially other religions as well. And in one study, among 4 major denominational groups, they reported that 37% of Christian leaders acknowledged engaging in some sort of inappropriate sexual behavior for a minister, with 12% confessing to having sexual intercourse with a congregation member. And a more recent study done by sociologist Mark Chaves out of Duke Divinity, he reported that the average number of women victims of clergy sexual misconduct per affected congregation is actually 7. So before this topic even gets to the public, before people actually find out about what happens, on average, 7 individuals have already been impacted by that minister or by that situation. That suggests that these kinds of struggles and experiences are vastly underreported, not only from a general population perspective, but especially when it happens within Christian communities, right? And this statistic suggests that only 23% of survivors reported the abuse to religious authorities, and even less to civil authorities. And to kind of contextualize this in real life, I wanted to share an excerpt from an interview that I conducted with a missionary colleague. And this is what this person said. I heard about a missionary kid in a missionary boarding school who was sexually abused by a staff member who was also a missionary, and her parents informed the school. So this is actually the minority that actually brought it up. They informed the school and they informed the mission agency, but were met with indifference and inaction, right? The school and agency felt like it might cause problems for them if they exposed this staff member, so they encouraged the family to work through this incident privately, right? And this is just one example. I've heard of many, many other situations where people might even add a different rationale, like, well, this will hurt God's work, this will hurt the ministry, so we shouldn't really talk about this, we shouldn't really move it out into the open. So the next question I have for you to discuss, and I promise I only have a few, is the following. If this is a pattern that you've observed in the context that you've served in and grown up in, my question is this: why are so many churches and Christian organizations reluctant to address these sorts of serious problems and instead try to cover up, ignore, and minimize these situations? So for those of us joining in online, feel free to text your input. I'd love to get your input on this as well. But for those of us here, if you have a few moments, discuss this with the person next to you. Let's go. Okay, let's come back together. Again, some really, really wonderful conversation. And looking forward to the Q&A as well, especially to see what comes out of all this conversation. So to continue this story, let me share the second half of it. And this event naturally caused this missionary kid to wonder if God cared about her situation, and went a long time believing that her problems or her trauma were not important to God and were not important to the church. This type of spiritual trauma leads many missionary kids and adult missionaries as well to leave the church when they've grown up, right? So just to give an example of how, when these things aren't handled very well or thoughtfully, they can really directly tie into both issues with mental health, but also spiritual wounds at the same time. In fact, the research literature suggests that conflicts with ministry team members is actually one of the greatest sources of emotional wounds in ministry, and perhaps the number one source of missionary attrition. So conflict within the ministry group actually accounts for more distress and negative outcomes than even the challenges inherent in working with the unreached, challenges related to finances and fundraising, challenges related to doing work cross-culturally, challenges related to the ministry itself. It's as if we're shooting ourselves in the foot, training so many leaders to go overseas when we actually leave early because we don't get along with each other very well, right? And one of my colleagues is a psychologist by the name of David Wickstrom. He's a member care psychologist that serves several different missionary organizations, and he conducts psychological assessments for candidates who are hoping to become missionaries over the long run. And I had the wonderful privilege of picking his brain and his many decades of experience in doing this kind of work. And when I asked him about ministry team conflict, his response was, so much of ministry conflict is actually due to poor emotional or mental health of ministry team leaders as well as ministry team members. So when he does psychological assessment batteries with potential missionaries and pastors, he identified a number of red flags that he has learned over the years. And some of these red flags include major mental illness, severe depression or anxiety, bipolar, somatization, chronic fatigue and burnout, as well as a history of addiction and family issues or inappropriate sexual behavior. But can you guess what was the number one red flag? I actually heard it when I was eavesdropping on you guys. Personality disorders. That especially with narcissistic personality disorders and borderline personality disorders, those two are the most common and the most destructive potentially for ministry teams. And he added that one of the most destructive combinations is when you have someone who has natural ministry giftings, but he or she also has personality disorder or deficits in character, because unfortunately, so many of our ministry contexts, we equate spiritual maturity with ministry giftings, such that if someone is a great preacher, is naturally gifted in all these other ministry skills, we will naturally assume that they got it all together with the Lord. But if they have those things and they have a personality disorder, that's setting ourselves up for a really unhealthy, dysfunctional ministry culture and ministry kind of family system. And this is straight from Dave Wickstrom. He says the following: on rare occasions and to my chagrin for various reasons, countertransference, exceptional faking abilities, or defensiveness on the part of the candidate, I had downplayed the data evident on the testing and had mistakenly given a candidate a clean bill of health and a statement of their readiness to move overseas. There was a time when I had downplayed a classic borderline personality profile in the MMPI-2. In case you guys are wondering, the 2, 4, 6, 8, but the 4 is not necessary, like the 2, 6, and 8. Although I know you guys are on the MMPI, I'll quit nerding out, but you guys know what I'm talking about. Because the candidate was so articulate, I found out later that they had an IQ in the genius range, and I was fooled. Needless to say, when that candidate became a missionary and almost destroyed the work and the people on the team, I was able to look back and have determined to never mistrust the data again. Right? Really sobering stuff. So let me continue. The research literature also identifies another factor that contributes to ministry wounds, and this has to do with unfortunately, the often a pervasive lack of safe and confidential spaces that Christian leaders find themselves in. That if they're struggling, if they struggle with doubts, if they're just struggling in general, there just really oftentimes isn't much of a context or isn't spaces for them to share vulnerably and share authentically, because oftentimes people in our churches aren't ready for that kind of conversation from the pastors. And as a result, many of us feel like we don't have anyone to talk to, even when we're feeling burnt out, even when we're struggling with marital problems, so on and so forth. Because if we do share, there are actually a lot of stories where the churches will kick them out of the ministry if they find out. Fears that they might be judged by people because they're supposed to be a Christian leader. Fears that they might lose financial support if this gets, their financial supporters catch wind. Or fears that those they are ministering to will not want to become Christians, and other outcomes like this. In fact, in one of my therapy clients that I've been working with for over a decade, he had experienced a moral failure, and I won't go into details. But as a pastor, he, from my opinion, took a very sound and upright approach. He confessed it to his wife, he confessed it to his family, he confessed it to me, he brought it up to the church leadership. And then, unfortunately, when he brought it to the church leadership, everyone started backing off and backing away. And he was let go, and the feedback that he received is, we don't believe this kind of thing can change, and part of the work that we did together was trying to hold this dissonance between this explicit language that was spoken at church about grace and mercy and forgiveness with this implicit behavior of, hey, when I see things getting messy, I don't want to touch this. I'm kind of taking a step away, and I don't even want to, go into it. And when I think about this, not just as a psychologist, but perhaps from more of a systems-based perspective, I'm thinking of, well, what are we reinforcing, right? When someone struggles, or when a leader struggles, or when a leader has encountered failure, if our system is going to respond in that way, what I'm actually reinforcing is for leaders to keep this to themselves and not bring it up, because it's just going to make things worse. And that, on the whole, does not help the testimony of Christianity or the ministry or of Jesus himself. So as a result, many Christian leaders will isolate and hold their pain and just keep going on, despite the further hurt that this may cause to themselves or to others. And this could be related to lots of different things, like maybe fears of being a failure in the ministry, a belief that God cares more about their work than their well-being, encouragement from other fellow Christians to keep going despite all the difficulties and crises and trauma. And, again, fears that Christian communities and organizations might be dismissive and judgmental of their difficult experiences. So I'm wondering, we don't need to discuss this, but I'm wondering if you have ever heard statements like the following, spoken to either yourself or to other people who might be going through some emotionally difficult experiences. And some of these are mixed, so I'm not saying that they're all, negative, but some of them can be pretty hurtful. Statements like, don't feel bad, or, don't cry, or even worse, it's God's will. Well, at least you still have this, look in the bright side. And I think it's tricky with that last one about, just pray about it, or let me pray for you about it. I feel very mixed about it. And I'd love for you, as we continue this conversation, to reflect on what are other statements that you have heard that may sound very spiritual, they may sound very Christian, but when you really look into it, it's not very helpful. It's actually quite hurtful, and it's not even designed for the person that has experienced the hurt. It's actually more designed for the person who's speaking to them, almost to give them an excuse to kind of move on with their life and not engage with that person. So this brings me to the literature and the topic of social support. Because one of the most robust and consistent findings in the trauma psychology literature as it relates to recovery from trauma is the crucial role of social support in facilitating and potentially hindering as well recovery from trauma. So research has found that social support is actually one of the most powerful determinants of either facilitating or impairing recovery from traumatic experiences. We also note that some traumatic experiences are actually more socially acceptable than others, and that if we think critically, not only from a cultural perspective, but also from like a kind of an Asian American cultural perspective, but also thinking from an American evangelical cultural perspective, there are actually some traumas that are more socially acceptable than others. So for example, if I went and fought in a war and fought for my country and I have PTSD, we honor that, we revere that. And at the same time, within certain Christian communities, trauma that might have to do with sexuality or a sexual trauma, that induces a very different response, a response of shame, of I don't want to touch that, right? So perhaps one critical point of reflection is, in the cultures that you are embedded in, how do some forms of trauma, how are they more socially acceptable compared to others? And with social support, we're thinking of the responses and the accompaniment of family, friends, even church congregations and ministry teams, so on and so forth. And interestingly, empirical research has also found that the lack of social support, and especially the presence of negative social support, such as blame, is actually one of the strongest predictors of PTSD and a strong impediment to recovery, so much so that one study even found that the lack of social support actually more strongly predicted PTSD than other factors, including prior trauma history, prior mental illness, and even the severity of the traumatic event itself, right? So, the way that your primary support network responds and reacts to what happens, that actually predicts your well-being more, potentially, than the severity of the event itself, right? So that's how critical it is for us to cultivate the kinds of healing and healthy communities and support networks within our churches, and how powerful that can be, how much of a powerful force it could be for the mental health and well-being of the communities that we serve. In fact, most of the individuals that I work with who have gone on to develop clinically diagnosable PTSD, almost always, if you dive into their social support network, there's almost always an epic failure of epic proportions in their social support network. On the level of, say, with a young woman who just survived a sexual trauma, hearing the first statement that she might hear from a mother or from a family member or a church member might be the question of, well, why weren't you more careful? What were you wearing at that time? And imagine, drumming up the courage to finally share what happened, and that is the first thing that you hear, right? So, what is a formal definition of social support? One definition reads as follows: those social interactions or relationships that provide actual assistance, or at least a feeling of attachment to a person or group that is perceived as caring and loving. Interestingly, I don't know what to do with this, but one set of findings in the literature suggests that perception of social support may actually be more important than actual support. Because I also know of individuals who actually do have quite a lot of support, but they're not convinced that people actually support them. So that's really tragic, because even though they have that support, all the consequences of not having support potentially can still apply to that person, right? And social support can be both positive, the kind of support that makes us feel loved, or negative, the kind of support that makes us feel unloved or isolated. Let's talk about negative social support first. Negative social support are reactions that are intended or perceived as either critical, blaming, or grossly insensitive. Here's some examples. At least you didn't use a weapon. You're lucky. It's over. Try to put that behind you. And unfortunately, some Bible verses can be misused to this end as well. God's ways are higher than our ways. The Philippians verse, whatever is true, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, think of those things. I've had people hear those verses to them. They want to talk about what happened. They want to talk about their trauma, and they're hearing from their Christian colleagues, don't talk about that. Just talk about things that are good and pure and true. And that's really more about their lack of them being uncomfortable hearing it than the trauma survivors' need to actually make sense and make meaning of the experiences that they've gone through, right? And a lot of this negative social support fundamentally is either communicating or reflective of indifference, like maybe people really don't fundamentally care, or they have the effect of encouraging avoidance. Just stop thinking about it, right? And for those of us who are familiar with the trauma research, one of the most, the primary means and channels, one of the primary pathways into post-traumatic stress disorder is actually experiential avoidance. Right? Not only is it a symptom of PTSD, but is actually the pathway upon, or the linchpin upon which all the other symptoms of trauma tend to hang together. And unfortunately, in too many of our Christian communities, we will offer a theology that's not trauma-informed, that actually functionally serves as a means to spiritualize experiential avoidance. We can talk about this all day. Right? Research also finds that when both positive and negative social support are present, unfortunately, negative social reactions are actually stronger predictors of PTSD, right? And some examples of negative reactions include blame, doubt, as well as criticism, like stop talking about it, it's over. And another Bible verse, don't let the sun go down in your anger, you shouldn't be angry, right? Another form of negative social support is emotional invalidation or indifference. And research suggests that this actually might be more damaging than overtly negative social reactions, because the latter are easier to dismiss and identify openly, and the former, it's a lot trickier, right? And it's this idea that if I just went through something that was really hurtful and I know that it's a big deal, if everyone around me just acts as if it's not a big deal, I start questioning myself, and I start questioning, well, was this actually really a big deal at all? Maybe it's true that I should just get over it. Maybe it wasn't that big of a deal. And as a result, guess what? I'm not going to cope with it. I'm actually not going to give it the attention and the investment that it requires, because I'm going to just take my cue from my environment, which is this actually isn't a big deal, when in fact, it's a really big deal, right? So it suppresses our natural coping responses. It leads us to stop reaching out for help. And it also enhances negative self-appraisals, so that when we have this dissonance between a situation that was really a big deal and really hurtful, and I internalize this message that it's actually not that big of a deal, and guess what? I still find myself in a position where I'm struggling. Guess how I'm going to make sense of that? It must be my fault, right? This isn't a big deal, but I'm making it a big deal. Maybe it's true that I'm the one that's the problem, and I'm just being sensitive, and I just need to trust in Jesus more and move on, right? So a lot of these negative, sorry, I'm thoroughly depressing you guys. I also hope I'm validating some of you guys too, because I know a lot of us here have gone through this, and maybe just talking about and having language for it could be a validating experience, right? So that we know that we're not the only one, right? And when I think about beliefs that are commonly endorsed by trauma survivors, it makes a lot of sense when I try to connect them with these different forms of negative social support, like blame and criticism, invalidation, indifference. A lot of these beliefs that we commonly will see include the following, where the survivor feels like he or she is responsible for the abuse, like it's their fault, that it's wrong to show anger or frustration or defiance or a critical attitude, like we're not a good Christian if we feel or respond in that way, where and there's also oftentimes our understanding of the past and the present, it becomes fluid, where emotional hurts in the present will actually bring us and trigger emotional wounds in the past. And the emotions that come up is a combination of what's right in front of me and the situation that's right in front of me, as well as a lot of historical hurts that have never been fully healed or even addressed. There's also beliefs that, well, maybe I shouldn't even think about it because I can't handle the memories. Or worse yet, there's oftentimes, if you really dig deep, you'll often find this deep-seated belief that, I actually deserve what happened. And as a result, I must be punished, So it's a deeper sense of kind of self-blame and of shame. And then last, that I can't trust myself or other people. So one more thing that I would love to highlight about this topic of emotional invalidation is that it has two primary characteristics. The first characteristic is that it tells the individual that he or she is wrong in both their description as well as their analysis of their own experiences, right? Do you see the irony of that? This is other people telling you that you are wrong in your own experience, right? And so essentially the outcome of this is this message that you cannot trust yourself. Right? And granted, we're not perfectly trustworthy, but I would suggest that most of us are probably more trustworthy of our own selves than other people are of us. So that's the first characteristic of emotional invalidation. And then the second is it attributes their experiences to socially unacceptable characteristics or personality traits. So, how many of you guys have grown up in environments where if you find yourself upset or anything other than perfectly happy and perfectly joyful and perfectly productive, then you will oftentimes get a label like, oh, you're just being sensitive. Right? So, it's not the situation that you're in. It's not even the work of other people that hurts you. The problem is actually you, and it's because you're sensitive, right? And these are the two common characteristics of a emotionally invalidating environment. And unfortunately, it happens too often in many of our family of origins, even in our spiritual communities as well. Invalidating environments, and this is the last slide, I promise. I'm going to talk about emotional invalidation. They're generally intolerant of negative affect, right? So if a child or an adult, imagine being told as a child, if you cry after you got hurt playing, your mother will give you a real reason to cry, and if tears continued, your mother would hit you or your father would hit you, right? And that communicates that, hey, half of your potential range of affect that God created in you to feel, that is unacceptable, and the environment cannot hold and cannot tolerate that, right? Invalidating environments also carry the belief that any individual who just tries hard enough, they can make it. You can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and because of this, that is the foundation of, well, because anyone who tries hard enough can make it, if you're not making it, if you're still negative, and if you're still crying, it just means that you're not trying hard enough. It's your fault. So not only are you sensitive, but maybe you're lazy, you're not trying hard enough, right? Mastery and achievement are highly valued, especially as it relates to productivity and controlling emotional expression. And a great value is placed on being happy, or at least looking like you are happy, right? So a lot of times in psychological assessment, we make observations where someone is describing a very sad or very hurtful experience, but they're doing with a smiley face, and we call that, affect incongruent with mood, right? And there's a reason why we do that, because that's what a lot of our environments conditioned us to do, right? And last, that there's a failure to live up to these expectations. They lead to disapproval, criticism, and attempts to bring about or force a change in attitude. And we can talk about this all day, but I want to just suggest us to reflect on the question, to what extent are these values embodied in many of our Sunday school curriculum, are embodied in many of the explicit as well as implicit kind of culture of a lot of the churches that we grew up in, right? A lot of times I would suggest, I grew up listening to Christian radio, K-Love, up in Northern California. And if you guys remember and I love K-Love, we support them financially back in the past as well. And if you remember, what is the motto of K-Love? Positive, encouraging, K-Love. What might that potentially suggest? If I'm negative, hurting, in grief, that might not be Christian anymore, right? There's a lot to be said about how, unfortunately, I believe American evangelical subculture has conflated toxic positivity with the Christian faith, right? Glenn Pemberton, he did research on lament in the Psalms. And he found that upwards of 70 to 80% of the Psalms in Scripture qualify as Psalms of lament. And he compared that to the top 100 worship songs that are sung in evangelical churches in America. And he found that less than 5% of the most popular songs we sing could even potentially qualify as lament. This morning, I did a conversation and a workshop with brothers and sisters in Ukraine who are still in the middle of war. And we had a conversation about worship. One person shared about how he is a third-generation Ukrainian Christian and how all the indigenous worship music was actually done in the minor key, and how it reflects the long history of persecution and oppression that Ukrainians have survived. And he held that in contrast with a lot of the worship music that was imported from America and was all in the major key. It was all about celebrating. It was all about triumph. And they asked the question, is there something wrong with our worship? And I said, no, there's something wrong with our worship, right? Because we have lost 80% of the biblical language that covers more than 50% of all the possible emotions that God created us to have. Right? So we really need to start thinking seriously about trauma-informed ministry and trauma-informed theology. And I would suggest that trauma-informed ministry, trauma-informed theology is actually theology proper and ministry proper, right? But we have to call that just to distinguish what it is, what is so common in what we observe here in America. Okay, believe it or not, I have a whole ton of other content to share, but I do want to begin to transition us to our panel discussion and Q&A. But before that, I just want to relate a little bit of this conversation to spiritual formation and share with you some potential implications on spiritual formation. So as Dr. Wang shared earlier, I'm really excited about the new role that I'll have here at Fuller, and the title of my role is I'll be the Cliff and Joyce Penner Chair for the Formation of Emotionally Healthy Leaders. And part of my excitement for this role is that we want to look at theological education and how we can reshape theological education so that we can take seriously not just intellectual formation, not just spiritual formation, but also emotional formation and human formation. And in fact, to recognize that those are all intertwined holistically as well. And one of the research grants that I oversee that's funded by the John Templeton Foundation is actually an empirical research study on spiritual formation involving 18 different seminaries throughout North America, over 1,500 students, ecumenical in scope, and we're in the process of applying for the next phase where we might go global, and I'd love to bring you guys into that project. And part of the fun that I've been engaging in for the last 3 years, I've been flying all around the country, meeting with different experts on spiritual leadership and spiritual formation, with a group of Roman Catholic spiritual directors, with different other Christian leaders. And I asked them the following question: how do you define or understand spiritual maturity? Right? What observable qualities or indicators point to the reality that formation has occurred in your students or in the people around you? And more pointedly, I asked them the question, how do you tell the difference between someone who really possesses the substance of spiritual maturity compared to someone who's just really trying to look the part, right? And here is what a group of Roman Catholic human formation and spiritual directors shared with me from Mount Angel Seminary and Abbey near Portland, Oregon. They talked about how spiritually mature individuals are individuals of freedom, where when they act, they take ownership, they choose the course and direction of their life. They don't do it out of pure duty or pure obligation. Even when it's difficult, they willingly choose the path that they go. They're also highly and deeply relational people. They're people of communion with deep relational capacities, not only with God, but also with one's neighbor. They're affectively mature. they're emotionally, perhaps you can say emotionally intelligent. They're aware of their internal emotional states, and they're equipped to cope with these internal states. They're interculturally competent, particularly as it relates to the treatment of the marginalized. And in fact, when I had a conversation about intercultural competence and spiritual formation, they talked about how their seminary students receive specific feedback if their spiritual directors notice that they only talk to people who look like them and are from the same area. And that they actually get feedback, you need to talk to your brother from another part of the world because they are also part of the family of God, and this is important for your formation as a Christian. I would love to get more of this in evangelical circles and in Protestant circles as well. They also spoke of the gift of compunction, where people are, after moral failure, they're able to return to the Lord faster, compared to where they were at an earlier stage of life. That they don't sink into despair or shame as often or as deeply, and that they're not as surprised or shocked at their capacity to think and act in ways that are sinful. Like a lot of times when we sin, aren't we kind of shocked at ourselves? I didn't know I was capable of doing that. Well, a spiritually mature individual actually does know that, and they're not shocked by it. And because of that, they're able to pivot back to the presence of the Lord without going through that dance that I've done so many times where I'm praying extra hours, I'm doing more things just to prove that I can be miserable, to prove to the Lord that I feel really bad about what I did, right? They don't do that. They can just go straight back to the Lord. Spiritual maturity also has implications on how we wield power. We need to have a conversation about that, especially in our political landscape in America. And then last, they talked about the dangers of wanting to choose one's own cross and how, as believers and followers of Jesus, we're not free to do that. Instead, we are to take up the cross that we have been given to bear, sometimes voluntarily, a lot of times involuntarily. And I would include even our situation with COVID to that extent. So let me stop here, and let me invite. Should we do Q&A now, or should we go straight to the panel? Yeah, let's go to the panel. If I can invite our fellow panelists to join me. I'm looking forward to just chewing through and reflecting and contextualizing this whole conversation, specifically on the diversity of Asian American experience. But thank you for listening and engaging. Actually, Pastor Kevin had a really good idea. Why don't we take a few-minute break? So why don't we all stand up, walk around, and when you guys come back, we'll continue with the panel discussion. See you soon.
did not know all those things about you, but it's so awesome that we will work together. And I was thinking, like, there's
Good stuff. I think that was valid. Like, get pushback, raise. So, a lot of times, I mean, I'll still do it, but then there's
more that
I am looking forward to kind of adapting. Which I think will be
that's good. That's refreshing.
have a pen and then
Oh yeah.
but maybe we'll start with I think would you guys want to maybe start I'll invite you guys in and then we'll start with the first question. Or what have you heard back to emotional business?
Little cups.
Okay, let's come back. And that was a great idea, Pastor Kevin. I think I really benefited from that too. So I want to start this panel by inviting the different panelists to introduce ourselves, and then we'll jump into our conversation. So can we ask you to start, Dr. Jessica?
Well, happy Friday, everyone. I'm Jessica ChenFeng, and I can't remember what we agreed upon in terms of our introduction, but I was thinking what's helpful for you to know in this context is I have a spouse, a very supportive feminist spouse who's putting down our 2 young children to sleep tonight, which I'm grateful for. My formal position is that I work at Loma Linda University in the School of Medicine, and I'm essentially a therapist for our physicians at Loma Linda. And I also teach in the School of Medicine, but the bigger arc is that I'm a marriage and family therapist and have been practicing for over 15 years, and for a while had a private practice locally. And I think it's also helpful to know some of my church context. I identify as second-generation Taiwanese American. I was raised in a Taiwanese evangelical church and have moved to a Korean church, to a Korean United Methodist church, and most recently to a predominantly Asian American church with my family. And so my ministry and various social, cultural contexts are in those spaces. So that might be helpful for you to know.
Hi, good evening. My name is Kevin Doy. I'm a seminary chaplain here at Fuller. I'm also an affiliate faculty member, and it's related to tonight's topic. I teach Asian American pastoral ministry. Prior to coming to Fuller, I was a senior pastor in the Asian American context for over 25 years, and so I'm not a psychologist. That's my disclaimer. Yeah, I think I'll just stop there.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eleanor. I'm a fourth year PsyD here at Fuller. Yeah. lots of doctoral students. I love it. So I'm currently here, my fourth year, as I mentioned. My topics of research can be found at the intersection of decolonization and Filipino psychology and liberation theology. It's a lot. I don't understand a lot of what I'm writing about. But it sounds really great, and I'm gonna come up with something. Just you wait. Yeah, so I identify as second generation Filipina American. My parents came here from Cebu in the Philippines, and I actually am still practicing Roman Catholic. So the information that you got from the Angels Ministry, I was like, yes, tell them, Catholics. So that's a little bit about where I'm coming from.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And I agree wholeheartedly. Well, I think a good place to start is I'd love to invite the three of you to share about, as an Asian American, what have you either personally experienced or what have you observed as it relates to emotional wounds in church contexts or other ministry contexts? And this could be in Asian American ministries or more multicultural ministries or predominantly, majority ministries. What have you observed or experienced as an Asian American?
So I'll share first on that one. I also forgot to mention that before joining this doctoral program, I was in a parachurch ministry working with them for about a decade. So have some experience in ministry as well. But I'll speak generally to some of that. I think it's a huge question. when you first put it up, I was like, oh, okay. Like, we're all going to try to talk about this as our first question. It's a big one. I think there's a lot of different ways that we could answer it. But the way that I'll answer it right now is, I think for me, there's an overlay of gender for me and systems of patriarchy. For myself, I'll share that despite being in ministry for a long time, having a lot of experience in certain areas, I noticed at some point that I was never chosen to be the main speaker of something or the main leader or the prophet or whatever it is that was considered to be the primary leader of a space. I was always given auxiliary leadership, you can help with the coordinating or you can help with leading worship, which is an important job. But I think for me, constantly getting assigned roles that were more relational, pastoral in that type of sense, it made me wonder, oh, maybe I'm not cut out for those other types of leadership positions. What is it about me that disqualifies me from that type of leadership? And so I started to internalize the idea well, I'm just not qualified. And so I started disqualifying myself. But the questions were always there, why not me? Is it because of my hair? Is it because of and honestly, I'm joking about it, but I was being honest about that. Is it because of the way I look? Is it because of my body? Is it because of the way I talk from the place that I come from? And so, it's one pathway that led to a ton of self-doubt that kept getting encouraged in these various spaces because the types of jobs I was given were be relational, keep giving of yourself, keep serving. And so I had no boundaries because I was oh, I'm here to serve. And so that has been detrimental to me in my personal, emotional life. And that was applauded in a lot of church spaces. So I think for me, the big wound feels like gender in a lot of ways.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Eleanor. And I've also seen that theme a lot. I can remember stories of other Asian Americans sharing about how they might have been the most competent, the most naturally gifted for leadership, and for whatever reason, they're not chosen, and they have to serve underneath someone else who may be less gifted or less mature.
and also wondering similar questions as well. Yeah, thank you. Can you, Kevin or Dr. Jessica?
Yeah, Eleanor, totally hear you on that. And actually, the things that I've been thinking about have similar themes. I know Dr. Wang spoke tonight on some more explicit abusive type behaviors in the church, things that we would expect would be traumatic, right? But in my clinical work, especially during my private practice, I worked with primarily Asian American Christians, largely women. And the two things that come to mind is one, the challenge in trusting oneself, right? That's a huge thing. Not trusting one's gut as Asian American women, it's like something wrong with me, along those lines, but also not being connected to myself and my relationships having a general quality of disconnect, right? So I know this sounds really general, but and I'm about to get really broad, but I think it does connect to a white cis heteropatriarchy. I think the world and context that we live in, there's a piece of I'm taught from the world at large in the U.S., but also in my ethnic Asian American church that is largely preaching related to a white American evangelicalism, so that I'm disconnected at multiple levels. Yeah, so those are some of the things that come to my mind because clinically the work looks like supporting women in finding their voice, right? Rediscovering their voice. And once that's sort of started to be felt, it's like, how do you start using your voice and feeling comfortable in your voice in multiple spaces? I also want to say this is much more recent for me because now that I work largely with physicians, I've worked with a number of Asian American male physicians as well. It's really shifted my perspective. I know that, we talk about male power, and I think that's, of course, a thing. But one of the things, as a family systems thinker, right, I'm always thinking relationally. And power doesn't just harm those who are oppressed. It harms everyone relationally, right? Because at the heart of it, this is what I've learned. Women, I don't know about you, other women, people who identify as women here. I feel like I've talked about my experiences with racism or patriarchy really easily, right? With friends, people in the classroom, but only recently have I started hearing the stories from men, Asian American men. And all the men have said, this is the first time I've ever talked about racism, my own personal experiences. So anyways, I share this because the layers of disconnect with oneself are profound. No matter the gender, no matter, but I think we'll talk about it in a bit, but the ways that that's connected to our church systems, to the larger United States context. So those are some of the things that have been on my mind.
Yeah, I think just to echo what Eleanor and Dr. Jessica have said is I think there's always an issue of inclusion that's at stake. When I teach my courses in Asian American Pastoral Ministry, the women are always among the best and brightest students, and the central issue for them is I don't know if I'm going to be able to minister out of who God has made me. I may never be a pastor, may never be affirmed for ordination, and those are very real issues. In my pastoral experience, I think the same goes true with queer, trans, LGBTQ folks. But I think in Asian American churches, I think, as is true in every church, one of the things I learned when I was a young minister, I had a mentor who told me every single Sunday, there are people listening for a word of grace. And do I belong here? Not just as an issue of identity, But with what I bring to church that morning, whatever concerns or burdens I am bringing, am I okay? Am I okay here? And I think pastors, in focusing so much on their sermon, I think often underestimate the pain that is right in front of them every week. I will say too, and as far as trauma is concerned, I think a lot of what we see in churches in Asian American settings is a product of trauma that gets passed down from generation to generation. Often Asian American churches, particularly those that are closer to the first gen, don't have the language to name or to understand that many of the relational issues come from trauma. And so as it gets passed down from generation to generation, sometimes we lose the original context from which the trauma was suffered. So it becomes decontextualized. And so it's very easy to pathologize Asian American culture in that way. And I think I just want to say that as a way of saying that if we understand that in addition to all the resilience and perseverance, I'm a Japanese American, the whole idea of gaman is the perseverance through very difficult things with dignity. I mean, there's some really wonderful, beautiful things. On the shadow side of that is, I think pastors aren't as trauma informed in many cases. We don't have the processes, we don't have the support systems. Pastors don't know that to refer outside to therapists for help. And so our churches suffer, and what we see are the negative effects. And, our people, we suffer from migration trauma, refugee trauma, war trauma, trauma of racism, racialization. And so all that exists in our churches, and if we don't have language for it, it shows up in other ways that we're not able to name. And we just say, my church sucks. That's basically what happens in our churches. It's like, my church sucks. And I just say that we need to work to bring healing and hope, and also to deal with empathy. So it's not to dismiss the behavior or the dysfunction that we see and experience. It's very, very real. But I also want, I've learned as I've gotten older to also have empathy, to try to understand what people have gone through. I think I'll stop there.
Good stuff. Thank you, all of you. And kind of continuing this line of conversation, I'm wondering, what are some of the cultural artifacts that you've observed in different, church cultures or ministry cultures that you believe may contribute to a lot of these emotional wounds that we've been talking about?
Can you elaborate on that question? I'm not sure what that question means.
Like a lot of times in many church contexts or ministry contexts, there's unspoken rules, kind of unspoken patterns of behavior, like, we don't talk about this, that either contribute or exacerbate a lot of these wounds that we've been talking about this evening. Yeah, what are some of those artifacts?
Yeah, actually, so what Pastor Kevin just said was in line with some of the things I've been thinking in relationship to this question. And I think it's a really important question, and what I am thinking about it is expanding it to include the context. And so my context has largely been ethnic churches, Asian American ethnic churches, largely first, second, and third generation, like in that range. And I'm going to tie this together. So you know that I work with physicians, and I don't know how many of you know what it's like to be a physician. I did not know before doing this work. It is really, really hard. And so most of my clients, the physicians, are burnt out. They work around the clock, and from the time they start medical school, they are in survival mode. So we all know survival mode, right? You're meeting your basic needs. Am I eating? Am I sleeping? Am I taking a break to go to the bathroom? That's where the brain is functioning at. And so I think about the pastors, the families that have begun these ethnic churches, right? They are in survival mode. They were in survival mode when they began and planted these churches. And so it is about meeting basic needs, right, of their congregation, of themselves, of their own families. And I never really thought about it from this perspective, but all of it to say, when we're meeting basic needs, our brains cannot function at complex levels. So to think like, oh, am I offering trauma-informed care? It's like, you can't go there. Your brain is trying to survive. And I have so much empathy for pastors, the ones of ethnic churches. They're putting out fires left and right. So much pain in families, all kinds of challenges in the immigration family life and struggle. So I guess thinking about it from that perspective, I think what trickles down ends up being, psychologically safe for a lot of people who are in survival mode is clear answers, right? Give me clarity. I need security. So theology looks very black and white. Theology looks very clear cut. If we follow this and do this, then you will have that, right? And then it emulates the white evangelicalism that is fed and that we're breathing in once you've immigrated here. It's like, oh, if white churches are doing so well, if we adopt this, then certainly we will have upward mobility, right? And our families will succeed and survive. But it doesn't translate, right? And so I guess I say all of that because that sort of concrete thinking, this is the way to believe in Jesus, right? And if we are a follower of Jesus, these are the things, this is what spiritual discipline looks like. This is what having quiet time looks like, right? I was a navigator in my undergrad, which I loved, right? But there were very clear protocols or ways of connecting with God. And even though those are great templates, again, it connects to the thing I was sharing earlier, which is disconnect from myself, right? That I have not learned to understand my own thinking. I haven't developed critical thinking to engage with my world, with my racial identity, with my gender identity. None of those things are addressed. So all of it to say, I feel for our Asian American churches, right? Our pastors, the leaders. And so I think we are all products of many of these spaces. So when you say, like, what are the cultural things that feed into it? I mean, I think it's a really complex question, right? So yeah, I'll leave it at that for now, yeah.
I love that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. Thank you so much for those thoughts. I feel like it's a helpful framework. I'll speak specifically to Filipino American, or my experience as a Filipino American, which I know is different. There's 5 of us in here, by the way. Just wanted to say that. Yeah. Hello Filipino people. So I'll share my experience, and then y'all can tell me if that resonates with you afterwards or not. But I think, related to what you were saying earlier, in my family, the way I've noticed as part of our immigration story and system is that we don't talk about the things that are difficult because they were in survival mode for so long. So sometimes I'll hear about like these traumas from like back in the day, and I'm like, for real? This is the first time I'm hearing about it, because they just don't talk about it. And so one of the things that I study is colonial mentality. And so one of the aspects of that is this idea of like, we owe the colonizers. Like, thank you so much for bringing culture and, education to us. And so a lot of times in Filipino families, you'll hear things like, oh, it's a good thing we're in America. Or if we're in church, it's like, we can't complain about being in America, we're here. And so that just feels like one symptom of what you were saying.
I think for me, that's a difficult question to answer. I think I'm echoing Jessica's answer. When you were sharing, David, I appreciated all the data. I was just getting bummed out. And I was
I have that effect on people.
I was sitting over there having to do my breathing exercises because I was having a trauma response because I felt overwhelmed that the issues are so huge. To be honest with you, I'm not an interventionist, I'm not a consultant, I'm an educator. I work with folks who are training to be in ministry. I'll be honest, I don't have a lot of hope for a lot of churches. I think it's just too much to ask. And many of my students are in those kind of churches. They're not senior leaders. They may be on staff, they may be youth pastors, and they're asking me, how do I change things? And I just listen because they don't have the platforms to be able to change things. And I think we just have to be real about that. So I will say the positive things about what I think what it ought to look like, because I do have hope for this generation and the next generation, for my children. So one is that I think we need to understand that the church is a therapeutic community. And, you know, I love the paradigm of Jesus and the Gerasene man who is thrashing in the tombs, left alone. I think that his community did try to help him at one point, but he was a danger to himself and others. Jesus comes upon him, and in addition to casting out the demons into the swine, it says that the man was sitting there, fully clothed. So he was naked, he was fully clothed, and in his right mind. And so there you see spiritual, you see physical. Jesus literally, I think, gave the clothes off his own back to the man and in his right mind. And of course, this man, having been healed at this level, wants to follow Jesus wherever Jesus is going next. And Jesus says to him, no, go back home to your family and friends. Because Jesus knows that his healing isn't complete yet, that there's a lot of walking up, being reestablished in society, becoming a fully fledged human person, benefit to society. He needs to relearn all of that. And the townspeople, it says, we're afraid. We're afraid, even though he was in his right mind now. They were afraid. They didn't know what to do with him. And that's a paradigm, I think, for the church, the Asian American church. So when I do think about Dr. Wang, your question about what is spiritual maturity, I do think about it's the ability to hold ambiguity. Mm-hmm. And so when pastors are not able to do that in themselves, they can't sit with a person who is in pain as a non-anxious presence, as you psychologists would know in family systems, right? Pastors are trained to give advice, not to sit in the pain with the person, to companion them. That's what we need. And the second thing I will say is that maturity is, the church is inherently social. So maturity always looks like fruit of the Spirit. So how do I know whether someone is faking it or not? Because over time, a person who's a jerk will act like a jerk and treat people poorly. So many churches treat their pastors the way that pastors have trained them to live. And so whether a person's matures is how well they treat other people. It's love, peace, patience, kindness. Those are not religious qualities. They're social qualities. And so I'd rather have a church that is okay gifted-wise, but loves people. Mm. And you can't fake that over time. So when we can create communities where we treat each other well, we treat people in the world well, we're a context for healing, then I think there's a lot of hope. Because that kind of church, I think, welcomes all people, includes all people, is able to companion with people in all their grief and pain and whatever they're going through without giving cheap, cliche answers, and to walk with people in their healing. I don't know what icon that is, but I think that's a vision of what we need.
Oh, thank you so much for that. Maybe just to close our formal panel conversation. A lot of what we've talked about reminds me of, I think it was from St. Francis, how they talk about the three selves. There's self-awareness, self-acceptance, and then self-gift. And that's actually how I locate my work as a psychologist in the work of God's kingdom. This idea of, by talking about things like colonialism, about intersectionality, and about healing the different fragments of ourselves, we want to help cultivate wholeness in ourselves, not as an end of itself, but so that we can give it away, so that we can accompany others and be present to the suffering of the world in an incarnational way, just as Christ was. So this idea of we need to have a self, we need to own a self, and so that this self can be given. And I feel like in a lot of ministry contexts, the self that we give is actually not our self. It's a colonial self, or it's some other form of false self that's based on an ideal that's just not very human, right? So with that, we want to open it up for you all to join this conversation. We still have about 15 minutes together. So if there's any questions that any of you have, I'll have this iPad with that will contain a number of texts. And if you happen to be here, you're welcome to either text and your question, or I think there's a couple microphones set up as well, so you're welcome to speak directly into the microphone.
I seriously applaud all of you for being here on a Friday night. Let's just say that. God bless you all.
I had texted a question in, but in case it didn't come, I just wanted to ask it. So, related to this conversation about black-white theology, black and white kind of binary theology, and invalidation in our environments, sort of as a response to pain or trauma, sort of a looking away because we can't hold it. I was wondering if any of you could speak to the role that mystery might play, sort of a spirituality of mystery. Dr. Doi, you talked about ambiguity, and it just seems to me this idea of mystery is like a really key spiritual resource we have, and whether even that might be psychologically protective for us as we're holding trauma or wounds that don't resolve or that don't fit sort of easy binaries.
Well, one of the things I teach is that the opposite of faith is not doubt, it's certainty. And I like to describe faith as it's when my kids were little, when they would want to hold my hand. Particularly my daughter, she would hold my pinky when I'd walk her to school. And there's a difference between my daughter apprehending me and comprehending me. There's no way she could comprehend me. And all that I was thinking about that day in her little world. But just by holding my pinky, she apprehended all of who I was. And so I think about God that way. What we do experience of God, we get all of God. But there's no way that we can comprehend all of God. And so we have to be, I think, comfortable with uncertainty and doubt. I think grace assumes failure. I think we have to teach that as well. That grace is not something that we get, or mercy that we get, because God dispenses that once we confess. It's all backwards. Grace is always present. Even our ability to confess or to come forward, to reveal, to share, to be vulnerable, is in response to God's grace that is always present to us. We need human persons to mediate that grace to us. Bonhoeffer talks about why can we confess our sins to God, but not to my sister or brother? Because we're just talking to ourselves. And so we need a sister or brother to be a real subject in front of us, to mediate the real presence of God's grace to us. I think the more that we can, in our liturgies, in our preaching, in the way that we do life together, just assume failure. It goes a long way to understanding that when things are messy, it's not the aberration, it's just how it is. It's just how it is. Life is hard. And so I think the gift that we can give to our churches is to take grief seriously. I'm Enneagram 4, so I live there. But it's like, is the cup half empty or half full? It's just empty. So, but.
Oh, I love that. And I think what I would add to that is that I think we're really onto something about ambiguity tolerance when you first introduced that. Because when you think of God, he's ultimate mystery. If we can't tolerate mystery and ambiguity, our capacity to behold and witness God is severely, lessened in impact. And in fact, we're doing some of the research. In fact, this paper is about to come out in a couple months. We looked at, in the seminary formation study I'm overseeing, we looked at theological conservatism. We started collecting data on Christian nationalism and xenophobia in the middle of COVID because, it's very obvious and very relevant to our time and day. And we found that empirically, there's a strong connection between theological conservatism and xenophobia as well as Christian nationalism. And that was actually mediated by ambiguity tolerance.
I think we talk about spiritual development or maturity and maturity. It's just maturity.
Yeah. Yep.
It's just maturity. It's just human development.
Yep.
So children need to understand black and white because they don't have the capacity to comprehend ambiguity and gray. But as we grow up, particularly in our teens and college years, right, which is often seen as backsliding, it's because we know that the world is a dangerous place with a lot of mystery. There are a lot of worldviews. We realize that. But our churches don't prepare us for that. And then our churches accuse us of backsliding, right? But in Fowler's stages of faith, that's a very necessary stage of faith. Because when you come around, and not everyone comes back to faith in Jesus, and that's always a possibility. But if they do, it's their own faith. And so our churches that are more binary, we keep our adults as children. That's what we're doing. We treat our adults like children. And so we wonder why our churches are like all the statistics. We don't prepare them for the real world that we live in. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, Dr. Wang, the research you just cited is so fascinating to me because that was always my guess, this ambiguity tolerance and some of the political things that we see. I'm like making all these connections right now from everything I'm learning from these colleagues. One of the lectures I give to physicians is on uncertainty tolerance, which is, I think, pretty much the same thing. The reason being, physicians are taught in a medical world where they need to always know the answer, right? You're the one who has to be medically competent. You have to make life or death decisions in a split second, so you must know the answer at all times. I'm the person who comes in to give lectures on resilience and social connections and relationship building. And I always have to preface my lectures by saying, I need you to put aside your competence brain. Like, this is not about being competent right now. Right now, we are switching to the part of your brain that feels very uncomfortable, and we're building your uncertainty tolerance. Because what happens is when physicians inevitably face failure, all of us do, but even in your role as a physician, they freak out. They are filled with shame. They don't know how to talk about it. They go into severe depression, all kinds of things. So, and I say that now because I love this question. I don't know if this sounds really extreme. I think mystery and ambiguity, tolerance, whatever, I think it's everything. I think it's everything in our social connections, in our capacity to be with ourselves as clinicians. I remember my first quarter here at Fuller as a master's student. I was sitting here somewhere. It was like mid-2000s. And the professor here was Dr. John Goldengay, teaching Old Testament, right? And I remember a student asked a question, and I'm like, wow, that was a really hard question. And I was waiting for Dr. Goldengay to give this really great, clear answer. He stood here pacing back and forth, and I remember he said, I don't know. The more times I've studied that scripture, the less I understand it. And I was like, in my early 20s, I'm like, what? Like, that was not my Christian world up until that point. It was always, every pastor had a clear answer. This is what that scripture means. This is how you live it out, right? And so it was my introduction to mystery. Not just spiritual mystery, but like, wow, there are things I can not know, even if I'm like about to retire from my career. And I say that because when we're in the seat of being the clinician, the therapist, and the client's waiting for an answer or wondering, right? There are certainly lots of things that we do know. Clearly, we have demonstrated experts on many topics, right? But there are a lot of lived life where we don't have answers. We can't. And are we okay with that? Does it cause us anxiety, right? And I spent many years working on my own anxiety, but I just think this sort of tolerance is everything, and mystery is everything. And so, yeah, thank you for that really thoughtful question.
That's wonderful. And there's actually another study that we're about to preparing that has found that things like xenophobia in the middle of COVID, it predicts lower anxiety. So there's a psychological mechanism. When you're in a highly, chaotic, uncontrollable situation, there's a psychological mechanism or human psychological vulnerability to want to make things black and white when you're living in a very gray situation, because it actually helps with our anxiety. And I think there's a lot of implications on Christian formation here, because it takes Christian maturity and character to withstand that temptation to make something black and white that should not be black and white. So in our case, we found that humility moderated the relationship between xenophobia and anxiety. Okay, looks like we have time for maybe one more question, and there's so many, and I'm reading through them. I'm feeling horrible because we can literally talk about this for the next 4 hours. But maybe for us to turn our conversation a little more practically, what are some considerations or directions that you might give a therapist if they are working with someone who is healing with spiritual trauma and wounds from a kind of a ministry context? Any thoughts there? Like, what have you observed to be kind of key points in people's recovery from this kind of experience?
I don't think this is a aha sort of answer. It's in line with the research that you shared about social support. When any of us, myself included, experience something that is really traumatic, medium traumatic, small, all of it is traumatic to the individual. I think there's either a human response or socialized response to feel shame about it, right? Depending on how acceptable this trauma is, like you were talking about earlier. And that impairs all of the possible recovery that can happen. And so I found, clinically at least, just like I think most of us are trained, is how do we start scaffolding someone's support system, right? I know in my work with physicians, when we talk about what support system do you have if you have suicidal ideation, I have worked with people where there is zero. there is no family, there is no friend, there is no pastor. And the people that become their community is their like inpatient. They have to be removed out of their work and be an inpatient, and that is the people that they start to talk about these things with, right? So I think brainstorming, being creative, so that I imagine many of us have experienced this. I know for myself, the moment we talk out loud about the things that harm us the most, hurt us, our pain, the things that we feel shame about, vulnerable about, it's that freedom. It moves toward freedom. It's that step toward healing and liberation. And so I just think that as much community and social support, and I think this is really important, the social support you're encouraging people to have, right? It's not just, oh, go talk to people that you trust about it. Not everyone has discerned what trust is, right? So really assessing people's trustworthiness about the particular topic, about the particular trauma, and making sure that it's really a good referral to make, so to speak. So I think if you are in a therapist role, those steps are really important. Almost to handhold figuratively with a client, with a friend, a family member, to getting that support. So those are just like your research is showing.
Thank you.
Something I'll add to that is it's important for clinicians to have this bigger picture, this ecological understanding of people, because the secretive nature of trauma, it can be become self-blame. I think of a lot of women in churches where it's like, well, I did something to put sex on my pastor's brain, or to put sex on this person's brain. I did, like what you were saying, like I wore something wrong to church. Like that's just one example of how if we don't address like these bigger questions of patriarchy, over-sexualization of women of color, for example, then that will perpetuate this like self-blame. And so clinicians need to be able to be aware. I'll give just one other really quick example is for Filipino Americans, if you let me get really niche with it a little bit. Colonial mentality, like a lot of people experience depression as a result of it. And so to just say, oh, this Filipino person is just sad, like it's completely missing the entire, like this huge bit of the experience of what depression is. And so we can't just say, it's not like mental problems in so many ways are not characterological failings of the people. It's this bigger context. And so I feel like that's a huge tool to help people, clinicians. And also for Andrew, congratulations on the scholarship, by the way. But one thing I also wanted to add to offer as a tool is acceptance and commitment therapy talks a lot about like mystery and like their whole thing is like psychological inflexibility is the problem of suffering. So just something to look into.
Wonderful. I love ACT as well.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll close our time with maybe one more anecdote. And this isn't necessarily a good example, but I remember when I worked with a pastor who had some significant emotional wounds in the church context. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about this topic, and when he finally shared the story with me as his psychologist or psychotherapist, I think I got so emotionally engaged, I dropped an F-bomb, and he knew that I was a pastor, so he was kind of shocked, and later he was explaining, when you dropped that F-bomb, that was a really healing experience because listen to your clinical supervisor. Don't listen to Dr. Wang here. Only what your clinical supervisor recommends as being not clinically contraindicated. But he said when you said that, I knew that you were angry with me, and I knew that it was no longer a shameful thing for me to talk about. So as a clinician, if there's ways we could, ethically and without getting yourself in trouble while you're still training as a clinician, non-verbally and also verbally, communicate that you are aligned with them and that what they're sharing is not actually shameful, I think that could do a lot of healing good with your individuals. Please. Yeah.
Real quick.
Because trauma happens in the body, I think there's room to, I think one of the things about Asian culture and Asian American churches is that white European Christianity has always been suspicious of our heritage and our religions. And so we don't know what to do with our bodies. So we have a disembodied faith. And so I think in the church, there is a lot of experimentation to do with breathing and movement that releases stress and anxiety from our bodies, where trauma lies. Second thing I'll mention real quick, Dr. Daniel Lee and I were talking at the break that because Asian Americans don't fit in the black-white binary, in the world, in white spaces and in mixed spaces, there's a lot of overt racism or microaggressions that when we share those in those spaces, we are dismissed or invisible, are not taken seriously. When we come into the church, unfortunately, because we don't have often the language, it just gets reinforced. And so one of the things that I think therapists who are sitting with Asian Americans can do is to validate trauma, to validate our reality of what's happened to us. Even, and it's hard, right? Microaggressions are hard to articulate. We just know something happened to us, or something's off, or it just feels weird, or it feels awkward, or it feels yucky, or shitty, right? There we go. Right, and we don't know what to do with that. And often we don't have the language for it. And so for someone to believe us and validate us, our experience is really huge.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And there's one question I just want to, we can't have time to address this, but I just want to acknowledge and validate it. There was a question about what about the emotional wounds of multiracial AAPI clients who may also not feel a sense of belonging even in their Asian communities. I just want to create space and mention that and acknowledge that as well, so that can be included in our conversation. Thank you again for coming. This was so wonderful to be with you all.
For being here, I want to thank Dr. Wang, also the panelists. This was such an insightful lecture based on literature, research, but also based on personal experiences and observation and wisdom from not only the psychology perspective, but also the ministry perspective, and also a contextual perspective from marriage and family therapy. I really thank everyone who's here on a Friday evening in person, and also thank all those who are online watching us. I know there's people from California, from Fuller, but also people from out of state. I know some people from Washington joining us here. And also want to thank our Asian and Asian American family community for being here, but also the non-Asian American community. You're seeing, and this is support. Someone was texting me, how can a white person be supportive to Asian American community? And I think this is just seeing you here and caring about us, being engaged in these topics is a huge support. So thank you all, everyone, for being here. And another round of applause for our presenters.